you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe?
Okay, this is Dr. Philip J. Resnick out of Cleveland, Ohio. He is the leading expert on Filicide. And I refer to him a lot in my debates because I believe in his theories on spousal revenge, Filicide, and mothers that kill. I've been following him for a long time. I've never actually reached out. He's an incredibly famous person in forensics. And I was thinking about reaching out. He's in the same state as I am. To see if he would, like Peter Hyatt. People kept reaching out to Peter Hyatt, and he did an analysis on Darley's 911 call, which is really interesting if you can look that up. And if anybody remembers the dialogue, she's an expert in behavior and speech. We hounded her, and it's out there somewhere. She did a thing on Darley too. So I was thinking about asking this guy what he thinks about Darley's case in particular. And I mentioned him a lot, and I just brought him up today in a post, and I thought that I would bring the people that watch my channel, the people that are looking at the Darley case and stuff like that, I thought I would bring Dr. Philip Resnick to the forefront so we could understand more of what it was that may have caused her to build up to what we had on June 6, 1996. It's a progression. I believe that there is intermittent explosive disorder involved in it. I also, I kind of believe that night, Darley was able to control Darren in such a way as she can make him feel like she wasn't happy, or she was going to leave, or she would flat out threaten to leave. And there's rumor that she did that to him a lot. Well, if you don't get this, I'll just leave. But in reality, Darren's mother, her background, Cerota, God rest her soul, wonderful lady. She's not like Darley Key. She wasn't. But her background was in CASA. She was a children's services worker. She was actually one of those people that would come to your house for a long time. So, Darley couldn't just take her kids and leave Darren. The business was in his name. All the income was in his name. For majority of her work experience was through his business. Financially, Darren was a little more stable than her. In a custody battle, she felt like Darren would win. And this is something that I discussed with Beja for everybody to hear, that it's no longer available. Because I've took a lot of stuff because of this case, and that's why that page isn't available anymore. That and some other stuff, but it all goes behind Darley, the harassment that I went through. But anyways, I'm trying to present Dr. Philip Resnick, and I want to show some of his views. He works on a lot of major cases. Let's have a listen.
I approach him neutrally, fairly, non-judgmentally, and it's sincere. And of course, once you've evaluated several hundred murderers, you don't have the intensity of emotion. Sometimes I'll have a trainee with me who's sitting down with their first murderer or first rapist, and they're having a lot more emotions than I am, simply because of my experience.
So it's in essence, you end up training yourself to be able to control if you are having those emotions, or you're not even having them anymore. I mean, when you go in, it's actually you're coming from a place of neutrality.
Right. No, I'm not having them anymore. And the different roles of people makes a difference in how they perceive things. if you're a prosecutor, you have contact with the victims and you see the perpetrator as very evil. If you're a defense attorney or a psychiatrist and you sit down and spend more time with perpetrators than victims, and you hear their life story and how they may have been abused as children or what have you, you don't develop the same kind.
That's important right there, where he says where they may have been abused as children. I believe that this is a key turning point in this case, and I believe this is where the proverbial ball started rolling. Because Darlie also had problems, as a teenager. She was home a lot with the other two kids. Darlie Key basically introduced her to Darren at 15 years old. So she grew up around 15, 16 years old. Growing up means that you move on to a relationship. To me, that's going to last longer. That's when you grow up. So that abuse as a child that she went through isn't discussed as much as it should be. It leads to quote unquote reason as to why Darlie would explode one night in June at a young age of 26. Remember, she was still writing in her diary up until age 26 about why did Dennis do that to her. It was still in her mind. And she had become also attached slightly to her abuser, which is a syndrome. I forget the name of it. Because she said she hopes that, Dennis gets peace and whatever it is, God fix it in him. But he mentioned abuse as a child. And it starts there. If you see someone that's having issues as an adult, with law and crime and anger and relationships, it's like Darlie only had a couple good friends. Mercedes, that girl, I believe her name is Jamie Clark, I think, and Karen and Terry Neal. Those are three that I hear the most. So I don't know. I'm interested in what this guy preaches here.
Kind of intense anger or feelings that I think the lay public would.
Well, that's interesting. Well, let me switch gears, and I wanted to ask you, you've done a tremendous amount of work and written quite a bit about mothers that end up killing their children. And over your entire career, you've worked on at least 40 to 60 cases involving parents who killed their children. And you were actually a consultant to the defense in the Susan Smith case. This is just really so that my audience has a sense of the extensive nature of your expertise in this area. And you also testified for the defense in the Andrea Yates case. We actually had on Park Dietz here who went the other way on and felt that she was in fact sane and able to be tried. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about this area because there have been a lot of cases in the news about parents killing their children at various different ages. Anything from a woman named Julia Powers, who was 50, a mother of two, who killed both her 13-year-old son and her 16-year-old daughter, saying that the son had mouthed off, and she ended up shooting both of them, to somebody like Andrea Yates, who had children that were a variety of ages, but younger, toddlers, and I wanted to ask you, what kind of a parent ends up killing their own children? And are there, and speaking, I guess I should speak of mothers at this point, because that's what I wanted to focus on first. Are there certain characteristics of that type of parent, of that type of woman, that generally are found when you're looking at women who have killed their children?
First, there's no single profile. I've actually divided women who kill their children into 5 separate categories, and I'm glad to discuss that. But they don't all fit a single profile. They may have very different murders. Some simply don't want their children and they kill them to get them out of the way. Others, like Andrea Yates, are severely depressed, psychotically depressed, and altruistically kill their children at what I call murder out of love rather than murder out of hate, where they genuinely believe they're doing the children a favor and having them enter heaven rather than remain on earth, which they see through the...
Remember, there's an exact quote from her journal that says, "I don't want you to grow up to look at me and see a miserable person, or see a miserable person every time you look at me. I don't want you to grow up. I don't want you to grow up." Favors
their own depressed eyes as a terribly cruel world.
And some of the other categories are?
Yes, another category which is relatively infrequent but dramatic is called spouse revenge. This tends to come up either in custody cases or after one spouse is unfaithful. The most dramatic case that I have encountered is a man from Indianapolis. He was engaged to a woman. The woman went on a Caribbean cruise with a friend that she'd signed up before she got engaged. And the man had his mother die while his fiancée was on the cruise. He called her and asked her to please come home and be with him in his time of great upset. She said, "You know, I spent a lot of money on this cruise," and declined to come home. He made up his mind at that time that he was going to make her suffer the way he was suffering. So he deliberately went on to marry her. They had a child together named Tyler. He waited until his wife was strongly bonded, and when the child was 7 months old, killed the child to make her suffer.
Wow. That's, and are there instances where if somebody's going through a divorce, I mean, let's just to focus on that because that is a big, I mean, we do see that in a lot of different news stories. I mean, that tend to, it's something that seems rather common because it's one of the types of stories that are followed a lot by the media. When that happens, is if you're in a particularly contentious dispute and there are threats like that made, is that something that people should generally take very seriously, or is that the anomaly in that type of situation?
It is the anomaly, but a couple of cases that I've seen is when the wife believes her husband has molested the children, and then there's a custody fight, and if the father has access to the children, the mother may believe, rather than the children suffering further sexual humiliation, that they're better off dead. So that's kind of a mixture of protecting the children and getting to the husband.
I have to say that when Dr. Dietz was on our show, he gave a fairly cogent and somewhat convincing argument for having found Andrea Yates to be sane enough for trial. Where was it exactly that the two of you particularly or specifically differed, and what was it that you told the court in terms of Ms. Yates' sanity?
Sure. Let me just clarify that it wasn't sane for trial. That's the issue. Was she legally insane? Meaning, was she culpable? Was she guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity? That's where Dr. Dietz and I differed. And Dr. Dietz and I agreed on three central issues. We both agreed that Mrs. Yates had a severe mental disease. We both agreed that she knew what she was doing was against the law. And we both agreed that she did what she did in a belief that she was doing what was best for her children. But we interpreted those facts somewhat differently. Dr. Dietz viewed her as knowing what she did was morally wrong and against society's view and God's view. In my own assessment of her, Mrs. Yates had delusions that if she did not take her children before the age of accountability, which she put at about age 10, the children were 6 months to 7 years old, she believed that they would end up in hell, that one of her sons would become a serial murderer, one of her sons would become a mute homosexual prostitute, and she had these terrible delusions about how all her children would come to no good. And it's a deeply religious one. It was more important to her that her children were with God in heaven for all eternity rather than living their life on earth. And although she expected to be executed, she loved her children, was willing to sacrifice her own life and her afterlife, even if she went to hell, as long as she could allow her children to be with God rather than in hell.
And this is why in the United States, motive has to be proven in a criminal case. But he puts that's where her mind was at. She thought that she was just saving these children from becoming these terrible monsters. And she really believed that. And that type of thinking is insanity.
Did you, in making that evaluation, and I saw you teaching about, there's a clip on the internet of you teaching and sort of going through the different steps of her marriage and talking about her husband. Did you speak with her husband? I mean, there was always this sense in I think amongst a lot of people in the country that how is it possible that the husband didn't pick up on what was happening with his wife? And that in some way...
That's right. It's the same thing in Darlie's case. It's like she's writing down that she wanted to kill herself. She's having outbursts. There are periods of time where she wouldn't come out of her room. She's sleeping down on the couch with the pathetic excuse that she would wake up because her baby, that damn baby, I have to go somewhere else to fucking sleep. No. Most women, if they had a child that was restless at nighttime to the point that it would wake them and only them up, even though Darren smoked half a joint before he went to bed that night, Darlie didn't say anything about it. It would wake Drake up. That Drake would get to rocking in his crib and it would wake him up. She said it would wake her up. So the best thing to do is get them, take all that jewelry off, put it downstairs, and just sleep downstairs. A lot of people don't know she had been down on that couch for about a week. A week. Think about that week. You know, that last night, she had the boys down there with her, but the 6 days being down there boiling, business is going bad, money's tight, stuck at home, no car, no shop till you drop type stuff going on, boiling for 6 days.
He was partly responsible, and I'm curious what your take was on not the legal role that he played, because we all know that she was responsible for that, but the role, if any, that he might have had in the deaths of those children by not paying attention to what was happening with his wife, or was it not obvious?
Sure. The public was very, very down on Rusty. People hated him. And in fact, there were hundreds of letters to the prosecutor saying you should try Rusty Yates. I did speak more than once with Rusty Yates. I went out to the home with him. He showed me the bathtub and so forth where the children were drowned. And I think he gets somewhat of a bad rap. It turns out that Mrs. Yates was under psychiatric care. In fact, she was seen by her treating psychiatrist
She really wasn't, and she should have been. She should have been. As soon as she wrote down about she wanted to kill herself, as soon as he come home, found, the dog dragged the pill wrappers out from under there. As soon as she started talking that way, he had the money, and he should have got her taken care of.
Psychiatrist less than 48 hours before she drowned her children. She denied suicidality. She denied homicidality. And if a board-certified psychiatrist could not foresee that she was a risk, I don't think it's fair to say that her husband should have foreseen it. It's not as if he didn't know that she was severely depressed. She was in treatment. So I don't think that he should have had any better ability.
Because he got her in treatment. He did recognize it.
To foresee it.
And, something that's a really interesting clarification, because I don't think that's widely known by the public. My other question would be with regards to Susan Smith, and I guess she falls into that category, and I might be wrong here because it's based on reports that I read, and it's better to have you right here.
Susan Smith, the kids were just in the way because the gentleman that she wanted to be with, that she was sleeping with, he told her he didn't want kids. He wrote it down to her. There's a letter out there, you can see it. He didn't want kids, and he broke up with her.
To ask the question of, but the reports indicated that or the idea from the prosecution was that she was trying to get rid of her children so that she could have a life with the boyfriend. Did she fall into that category as far as you were concerned, of mothers that kill their children? And what was your assessment of her?
Sure. I spent more than 8 hours with Susan Smith. And although the public was informed by the media of the version you just stated, that was not her version. Her version, which I gave credence to, was that she was indeed in love with a man. He let her know that day, the day of the drownings, that he was not going to see her further. And she accepted it as a loss. She decided to kill herself. She thought about how the children would make out with her separated husband, who she did not rate very highly. She decided that all three of them should die. She thought about driving into a bridge abutment, then decided to drive them into the lake. As she drove down toward the lake, she lost her nerve at the last minute, jumped out of the car, and the children went in the lake. Then she did a terrible thing. She lied, said a black man had kidnapped her, and so forth. But her account, which was substantiated by the boyfriend, was not that she was trying to make herself more attractive. A little interesting sidelight on that was Susan Smith told me how she confessed. The police chief lied to her and said, "Susan, you told us that you were carjacked at a particular spot, and we had cameras rolling because there were a lot of drug buys there. We've now checked the videotape, and we know it didn't happen that way. What really happened?" And at that point, Susan Smith confessed and said that she had driven into the lake. And a few hours later, she saw the police chief and said, "Is it true that you really had cameras there?" And he said no. So that was actually...
Isn't that interesting? Because there's a lot of people out there that think that she just had a guilty conscience and confessed, and I was one of them. Yeah, I didn't know this. I've never heard this interview before.
Actually, how they got the confession out of her.
And as any devotee of law and order will know, or also any lawyer, the police are allowed to lie to obtain a confession, although sometimes it gives the rest of us pause for thought in terms of the fairness of that. But nonetheless, that is the law.
Filha, tá amarrado sem mão.
Ei, que viagem é essa, véi? Da onde vem a miséria?
You're so loud, you pathetic fuck!
love you, baby.